Back, thank you for your company. I said last week on the show that we'd spend a little bit of time on this morning's program looking at the issue of concussion. Now, while this is evident in just about all contact sports, rugby, gridiron, even things like cricket we've seen in the past week or so, over the past few months we've seen a string of serious incidents strike in the AFL in particular, and it's grown interest in this, certainly for me. I mean, I'm no doctor, I'm no medical expert, so I know next to nothing about it. And I remember even playing junior football a few years ago that if you copped a bump to the head, they'd pull you over to the side, rub you on the ears and say, if you can see straight, if you can walk straight, you can go back on the field. Well, thankfully, we've got a bit more common sense these days. But I read earlier this week that the AFL released its annual injury survey for 2017, which showed each team dealt with an average of 7 concussion injuries for every season. Now, that doesn't sound like an awful lot, 7 injuries per year, 7 concussions. It seems like in a contact sport that might even be a low number, but when you add that up over the course of careers for these players, they could spend 15, 16, 17 years or even more getting these little hits, some of them massive hits, all injuries to the brain, to the head and to the neck. It can add up. And all of a sudden you start seeing some of the cases that we've seen this year with players out for months or years, or in some cases from 1 or 2 blows, their careers are even brought into jeopardy. You know, if you break your leg, you spend a year at home recovering on the couch, but if you break or if you injure your brain or your head, well, we might have return to sport protocols in junior sport these days, but while the information is coming thick and fast, it seems like the machinery and the bureaucracy at the top levels of sport are moving at a snail's pace. Now, I wanted to speak this morning to Dr. Adrian Cohen. He's the brain behind the Headsafe program, which is dedicated to reducing the prevalence of head and neck injuries in sport. He's the country's preeminent researcher when it comes to concussion and head injuries. I thought we'd turn to him this morning to try and make sense of it all. Dr. Cohen is on the line. Adrian, thank you for your time.
You're very welcome. Good morning.
I feel like we're constantly stuck between these two worthy pursuits when we start talking about head injuries in sport, Adrian, because on one hand you have a lot of traditionalists that say, no, we don't want to see the sports we love change. We don't want to lose what made us fall in love with the games in the first place, even if it would improve player safety. We don't want to see AFL players running around with helmets. We don't want to see rugby league players run around with shoulder pads. But on the other hand, you have people that say, no, the player safety and player health has to come first because it is so important. I'm beginning to wonder, maybe those two pursuits are mutually exclusive. Maybe there isn't a middle ground that's going to please everyone. Do you think that's the case here? How do we try and mediate these two warring sides that never seem to come together?
Well, player safety is at the top of everybody's wish list, and nobody wants to change the fundamental nature of sport. We know it's far more important to participate and to be active than it is to sit behind a desk, or worse still, to sit on the couch with a Game Boy in your lap. So there's no doubt about that. The real question is, how do we keep players safe? How do we let them know when it's not safe? How do we tell them how long they need to spend out of sport, and how do we supervise them coming back to sport? And let's face it, sport's only a part of their life. So if we're talking about kids, school's far more important. And, you know, for adults, so is their work and their home life as well. But the idea is to raise the bar on safety, not to change the fundamental nature of the sports we enjoy.
Do you think some people can conflate that a little bit, that some traditionalists think that any push to try and improve player safety, to restrict or to limit the risks of these kind of injuries, is almost an assault on the way the game has been played? It's an affront because it's always been done this way. It's always hard to change behaviours that have existed for years and years. Do you feel a bit of that pushback from within the sporting community?
Oh, definitely we feel that. But then again, you know, 3,000 years ago, we thought going down to the Sydney Football Stadium for an afternoon of watching people being torn about by the lions was a good idea too. We've moved along from that. And, you know, information helps us, education helps us, and attitudes do change, and attitudes to sport change. You know, if you think back into the early days of some of these sports when there were no interchanges, where players literally went till they dropped, we realised that wasn't good for them. So we adapt. So the whole idea in this spectrum of looking at head and neck injuries in particular is to work out how we recognise the fact that somebody's at risk and how we protect them. And at the end of the other, you know, time in their career when players are now starting to fear for their long-term mental health and for their well-being, the class actions we're seeing in the NFL, in the National Hockey League, back in the college football system in the US, let's be honest, we know they're going to come here. They all revolve around three fundamental elements. The first is that you knew there was a risk and you didn't tell us, and we counter that with education. The second is that you told me to get back out there as soon as I got injured. In other words, it was a sign of toughness. Now, there's no such thing as a tough brain.
Yeah.
And all those antiquated attitudes of, yeah, it'll make a man of you and it was tougher in my day and come on, the rest of the team is relying on you. Those things need to change as well when they're not in the interest of the individual. As they're not in the individuals of the interest in the individual, they're also not in the interest of the sport itself. So we've got to change that. And the third pillar for this long-term issue that we've got with players now taking action against their sports is that you pushed me back to play before I was fully recovered. So if we can tackle all three of those by education generally, by making sure our attitudes conform to what we now know in terms of the science behind these things, by recognising these injuries for what they are when they occur. It's not a head knock. It is a traumatic brain injury.
Yeah, I'm really glad you make that point, Adrian, because if I could just share with you a story that I shared with my listeners a couple of weeks ago that really made me want to look further at this issue once again. It's the story of a young bloke called Michael Close. He's only 23 years of age, formerly of the Brisbane Lions, now plays with the VFL side in North Melbourne. And he was playing a game at the beginning of June, copped a knock to the head. So off he goes. He is sat down at the side of the field, is assessed, and I think he sits out the rest of the game, but he's basically given the all clear, and off he goes home later that afternoon. But it was some 13 hours later that he starts feeling physically ill, throwing up, and can't sleep, is throwing up all the way through the night. So he thinks, look, this isn't very good. I'd better call the club doctor. And the club doctor says, that doesn't sound very good at all. Let's get you an ambulance. And the next thing he knows, he's lying on a hospital bed with a CT scan showing bleeding on his brain from a knock occurred on the football field. And then even last week, we were talking about Jeremy Cameron from the Giants with that terrible-looking elbow to Harris Andrews, knocked him silly. And at first we thought, gee, that's a rough concussion, but now he is dealing with bleeding on the brain, and who knows how long he's going to be out for. So to me, Adrian, I hear the words bleeding on the brain, and that terrifies the life out of me, to think that I or one of my friends or a footballer that I love watching could leave the field with a serious life-threatening injury like that. It is terrifying, and it's serious, serious stuff.
It is, but let's put things in perspective. Bleeding on the brain is not concussion.
Right.
They both come from the same cause, which is trauma to the head. But the vast majority of those are not bleeding. Now, the few people that need to and come to having a CT scan or an MRI are those where there are physical signs and symptoms that are getting worse. So headache that continues, people that become harder to rouse. Certainly as a doctor, when you're looking at a player, physical signs like one pupil being larger than the other, eye movement not being parallel in their gaze, the things that we learn as doctors to look for, they're indications that it is more serious and they need a scan.
So there's more gradual symptoms that kind of develop over time, don't go away after a week or so.
Well, the spectrum in concussion can take 24 to 48, or even as long as 72 hours to actually develop. And
right.
That's the simple, straightforward headache, disequilibrium, not feeling quite right, being in a fog, bringing in these visual disturbances. They can take 72 hours. Now, the bleeding on the brain, the life-threatening bleeding on the brain happens far more quickly, and people tend to go downhill much more quickly, and in some cases resuscitation, urgent scanning, and a neurosurgeon to intervene. But you can also have slower bleeding on the brain that takes longer. So anything that doesn't conform to our normal idea of concussion, which is that it comes on as a result of an impact, there are mild to moderate symptoms that people complain about. And everybody's different. Some people can have a headache for a month without complaining. For other people, it's the worst thing in the world. It's like an ice pick through the temple the first time they get it. They're not used to it. And we all express pain differently. So that you can't count on a player's subjective observations and their relating of them to you. What you can do is look for physical signs. And when there's physical signs, when you see a player unconscious, when you see them unsteady on their feet, where you see them ragdolling to the ground, unable to protect themselves.
Horrifying to watch some of it, yeah.
Yeah, we've all seen these, and we're seeing more of them, which makes us all more aware, which is a good thing, because we're now going, you know what, that's not normal. That's concussion, or it may be worse. Let's keep an eye on that person. Let's not send them home alone. In the old days, they used to drag you off the ground when you were unconscious, prop you up against the fence. The game would continue. If you hadn't fallen over by then, they'd drag you down to the pub. You'd have 10 schooners, and you'd drive yourself home.
Yeah, sip of water and off you go.
Yeah, now we don't do that anymore. There's no magic sponge out in the field. There's no smelling salts. We're starting to treat these with the gravity that these sorts of conditions actually require because we're all getting better educated. So we don't want to be alarmist and say each one of these is a catastrophic, life-threatening injury. But we do have to realise that it is a brain injury and we've got to give it a chance to heal. I say to coaches all the time, if that player had a hamstring injury and I told you he was going to tear it if you left him on the field for another 5 minutes, what would you do? And they go, we'd get him off the field, get the ice on it, we'd put him into our physio program and rehab him, but we'd get him back too early.
That's right.
And he'd be no good for next year. I said, yeah, the brain's like that and concussion's like that, except it doesn't show on the outside. There's no swelling, there's no tenderness, there's no red bit. The player doesn't go ouch when you stick your finger in it, but it's just as serious. But on the other side of things, and let's be positive, 95% of these will get better if we give them a chance.
Yeah, that's the key, isn't it? You've got to change your attitude towards the treatment, towards dealing with it, yeah.
Recognition, giving it the due time to heal that it needs. If you roll your ankle and somebody sends you back out there to play next week, you're going to do it again and again and again. If you get concussed and you don't get the time you need to recover, you're going to have more and more frequent concussions. You're going to have worse symptoms. And longer term, we now know that this leads to the phenomenon of chronic neurological impairment, early dementia, Parkinson's disease, mood disorders leading to depression and even suicide in extreme cases. And when you pass away, we have a look at your brain under the microscope. This is some of the work we're doing at the Australian Sports Brain Bank. See those pathological changes, which we now know are called CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So there's this spectrum, and it all starts with let's examine the actual incident, let's recognise them for what they are, let's give people a chance to get better. Now, some people just think about concussion as a big buffy bloke who's got a headache and misses the game. It is more serious than that, particularly in our kids. If you send a kid back onto the sporting field with a head injury, before their brain has had a chance to recover, they may not go home to their parents.
Yeah.
Second impact syndrome kills kids.
Jeez.
Not often, not common, 1 or 2 a year, but it's 1 or 2 tragic stories that we can do without by recognising this and by giving them a chance to recover and making sure they're okay to go back to their sport.
Gee, look, you took a lot of sense, Andrew. It's a message worth taking. I think I'm glad you mentioned before. I mean, we talk about throwing people to the lions 3,000 years ago, but I was watching not long ago the UFC where there's 2 blokes going hell for leather and 2 women in some cases as well, beating the tripe out of each other where they're sitting on the ground or lying on the ground with some 120-kilogram bloke beating their brains in. I mean, that's hardly a good look when we see people staggering off the football field, but when you've got 2 behemoths going at each other locked in a cage, that's hardly a good look either.
Well, I've got to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of these sports.
No, neither am I.
In fact, I'm not even going to call them sports. These are activities designed to cause a brain injury.
Yeah.
And let's call it for what they are. Now, we can decide as a society whether we want to have that or not, whether we enjoy boxing, whether we think it's a reasonable thing to do in this day and age. But then, in our other sports, a head injury is an accidental byproduct of the physical activity. Once we stamp out illegal play, and I mean stamp it out, I've always been one of the extremists that go, you know what you do for a head-high tackle or a lifting tackle or a spear tackle? You ban the player for a year. Let's see how many do that. If they know that the mandatory sentence is a year, not 1 or 2 weeks, not let's put them on report, not let the team continue. Let's make it a game-losing action. Let's make it a season-ending action for the player involved.
That would turn them off.
Stamp it out pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, I suppose that's half the challenge, isn't it? Trying to change behaviours that have been there for so long.